He was devoured alive by smallpox. Louis XV's body erupted, blackened, and collapsed in a stench that terrified Versailles. How did a king who ruled for decades fall to a disease that chewed him from the inside out? Stay for a grim-sourced account of the symptoms, the court's panic, and the final hours they tried to sanitize. Louis XV never imagined that the first tremors of his death would come disguised as something deceptively ordinary. For a king who had once been adored as Louis the Beloved, illness had always been a distant threat, reserved for lesser men. He had survived fevers, infections, and scandals. He had outlived enemies, wars, and countless political storms. To him, death was a distant abstraction, something he believed he had time to negotiate with. But in the spring of the year 1774, death approached quietly, settling first in his bones before revealing its true and horrifying shape. It began with exhaustion, strange, persistent, creeping exhaustion. Louis had returned from a visit to the Petit Trianon, where he had insisted on greeting commoners and soldiers along the road. Among them was a servant girl who was visibly ill. She leaned forward, kissed his hand, and thanked him for his kindness. Those present noted her flushed cheeks, watery eyes, and trembling voice. The king, ever indulgent of emotional displays, dismissed concerns with a wave of his hand. He had always believed his royal blood made him more resilient than others. That moment would become the fatal spark in a story that Versailles would spend generations trying to sanitize. Within 2 days, the king felt a strange chill spreading across his limbs. His physicians attributed it to fatigue. Within 3 days, he was confined to his bed with a sudden fever. By the 4th day, he developed sharp pains in his back and legs that made him grip the sheets until the fabric tore. It was only when the first red spots appeared, small, innocent, scattered like freckles across his chest, that his valet felt the first stirring of dread. Spots like that did not lie. Spots like that had destroyed families. Spots like that had left entire villages in ruin. Smallpox. The word whispered through the court like a gust of icy wind. It was not spoken loudly. No one dared. To say it aloud in the palace of Versailles was to invite panic. The disease had a reputation France feared more than foreign armies. It disfigured. It tortured. It blinded. It devoured. And above all, it killed. Louis XV had survived revolts, mistresses, political collapse, and decades of uneasy reign. But smallpox did not bow to kings. By the time his physicians admitted the truth, the spots had already multiplied. They were no longer faint red pinpricks. They were raised, hot and angry, spreading across his face and torso with terrifying speed. The king, who had once been the center of Europe's most extravagant court, now lay trembling beneath heavy embroidered blankets, his skin burning as if lit from within. He asked for water constantly, his throat raw and dry. Every swallow brought pain, yet even then, the full horror had not begun. Smallpox struck in waves, each more brutal than the last. Between bouts of fever, Louis drifted into strange half-dreams, muttering to long-dead friends and mistresses. He complained of a stabbing heat beneath his skin, as if something inside him was expanding. And in a way, it was. The virus was replicating, cell by cell, beneath the surface, preparing to erupt. The court tried to maintain normalcy. Ministers entered his chamber with forced smiles. Attendants perfumed the room heavily, pretending the king merely had a mild indisposition. But the truth could not be masked. Louis's complexion, once powdered and smooth, turned red, then purple, then a mottled combination of both. His eyelids swelled until he struggled to see. His lips cracked and bled. Smallpox did not merely mark the body, it consumed it. By the end of the first week, the disease revealed its true nature. The rash that covered the king was no longer merely visible. It was raised, it was blistered, it was filled with fluid. The lesions grew so rapidly that his skin took on the appearance of a grotesque, tightening mask. Every inch of him was covered: face, chest, back, arms, legs. His attendants recoiled involuntarily the first time they saw him fully exposed, and quickly begged forgiveness, realizing that instinct had betrayed them. Louis asked why they looked so frightened. No one answered. They could not. The lesions grew larger still, merging into clusters that distorted his features. His eyebrows disappeared beneath swelling. His nose doubled in size. His once soft cheeks ballooned into painful, feverish masses. When the blisters finally began to boil upward, some so full they threatened to burst with the slightest touch, the odor in the room shifted subtly, a faint sourness at first. Attendants noticed. Musicians avoided the hallway. Even physicians, trained to withstand much worse, exchanged grim looks. Smallpox had begun devouring the king alive. And Versailles, the palace of mirrors, perfumes, and opulence, would soon become a chamber of rot, fear, and suffocation. The worst had not even begun. If you're still here, you're exactly the kind of person who refuses the cleaned-up versions of history. Subscribe now and answer this. Should a king's final days be recorded truthfully or protected to preserve his legacy? Smallpox had already claimed most of Louis XV's comfort, but now it began taking something far more dangerous: control. By the beginning of the second week, the king's world shrank to the dimensions of his bed, and every hour felt heavier than the one before. His chamber, once the beating heart of Versailles, where ministers circulated and mistresses whispered behind fans, had become a sealed, suffocating prison. Only the bravest attendants still entered. Even fewer stayed long. The first sign that the situation was descending into a catastrophe was the fear creeping into the faces of those who served him. Louis had always been observant of the people around him. A lifetime of court politics sharpened that instinct, and even through fevered haze, he noticed their eyes darting away. He noticed how they held cloth near their faces. He noticed how they avoided touching the bed curtains, unless absolutely necessary. The disease was changing him at a pace faster than dignity could keep up with. Where his skin had been red and swollen the previous days, it was now stretched tight across the lesions. His face no longer resembled the portraits that decorated Versailles. The blisters had multiplied and deepened, giving his once gentle expression a harsh, distorted quality. He attempted to speak, but the swelling in his lips and throat each time reduced his voice to a strained rasp. When he tried to sit up, pain shot through his nerves like hot needles, forcing him to fall back against his pillows with trembling breath. The royal physicians, who were expected to maintain composure no matter the severity, abandoned their clinical calm. They knew the truth. Louis was experiencing confluent smallpox, the most aggressive form. Instead of separate blisters, the lesions were merging into broad sheets of hardened inflammation. His skin felt hot even from a distance. Touching it was nearly impossible. Worse, the fever that surged inside him created an internal heat so violent that he begged for the windows to be opened, despite the cold spring air outside. Attendants obliged, letting icy wind rush through the chamber, yet the relief was fleeting. The heat inside his body was not something fresh air could soothe. His mind began slipping as well. During the early mornings, he muttered to himself, naming people who weren't present: Madame de Pompadour, long dead; courtiers who had betrayed him; his daughters when they were children. In moments of lucidity, he grasped a servant's wrist and whispered that he feared dying unrecognizable. But the fever always dragged him back down into confusion. On the fourth day of his confinement, courtiers watched from the doorway as Louis attempted to drink from a cup brought to his bedside. His hands were trembling violently. When he lifted the cup, it slipped, splashing water onto the sheets. The king stared at the mess for several seconds, clearly humiliated, before turning away. No one dared comment. But everyone in the room understood that France's monarch, once a symbol of refinement and power, had descended into a state of helplessness. The disease attacked methodically. His eyelids swelled until they barely opened. His vision blurred from constant tearing. His breathing became shallow and irregular, each inhale through congested nasal passages, each exhale a faint, strained effort. Ministers tried to present documents for his approval, but he could no longer focus enough to sign. The realization dawned on the court like a storm cloud. France did not have a functioning king anymore. That terrified them far more than his appearance. With every passing hour, the palace grew quieter. Servants hurried through the corridors with lowered heads. Ministers spoke in hushed tones. The Dauphin and royal family avoided the chamber entirely, terrified of infection. Louis had become a source of fear, not reverence, in his own palace. And then came the moment that transformed dread into panic. One evening, as attendants leaned in to adjust the pillows behind him, Louis inhaled sharply, and a low groan escaped him, a sound so deep and involuntary that the ladies immediately recoiled. His body, weakened by fever and swelling, trembled beneath the sheets. The lesions had begun pressing against each other, distorting the skin around them further. Smallpox was now progressing into the stage that Versailles feared most. The king's scent changed again. At first, it was faint, a warmth in the air that smelled sickly and unfamiliar. By morning, it grew stronger. Perfume could not hide it. Neither could incense. The attendants exchanged worried glances, realizing that the virus was overwhelming his body's ability to cleanse itself. His sheets had to be replaced twice a day. Servants no longer lingered. Physicians requested shorter intervals between their visits. The disease was consuming him faster than they could respond. Louis still tried to maintain some semblance of authority. He demanded reports from his ministers, asked about the kingdom, insisted on hearing updates about diplomatic affairs. But each effort exhausted him so profoundly that he would fall into a fevered stupor minutes later. Then, as the swelling intensified, a new symptom emerged, one that terrified everyone present. Louis began struggling to breathe, not from panic, not from exhaustion, from obstruction. The swelling in his throat had grown so severe that he wheezed through each inhale. His physicians exchanged grim looks, whispering about the danger of suffocation. They offered potions, broths, tinctures. Nothing eased his lungs. The airflow narrowed each hour. Late that night, as two attendants stood by the bed, Louis tried to speak. His voice broke entirely. He opened his mouth, but only a faint, hoarse whisper emerged. His eyes widened with frustration and fear. He raised a trembling hand to his throat. The attendants froze. The king, the man who had ruled France for decades, could no longer form a single audible word. The disease had invaded not only his skin, not only his lungs, but his ability to communicate. Versailles, now steeped in dread, realized the truth. The king was being consumed alive, cell by cell, inch by inch, and there was nothing anyone could do to slow the inevitable. But the next stage, the most horrifying stage, had not yet begun. What awaited Louis XV would push Versailles into full-scale terror and transform his chamber into one of the most dreaded rooms in royal history. By the time Louis XV entered the third brutal phase of smallpox, Versailles no longer resembled a palace. It resembled a besieged fortress where terror seeped under every door. Servants avoided the king's wing entirely. Courtiers refused to breathe near the draperies. The royal family remained distant, watching events unfold from behind layers of protocol and fear. Even the seasoned physicians, who had seen horrors most would faint at, hesitated before crossing the threshold of the king's chamber. Because now, the disease was no longer simply ravaging Louis's body. It was transforming the atmosphere around him. The king's chamber, once filled with servants and murmured conversation, had grown quiet, unnaturally quiet. Only the crackling of candles and the king's strained breaths filled the space. The stench of illness, once subtle, now formed a heavy presence in the room, impossible to escape. It clung to clothing, to tapestries, to the very air. Even with windows thrown open, fresh wind could not wash it away. But the true nightmare was unfolding on the king himself. The lesions covering Louis's body had begun to merge into vast, inflamed patches. His once smooth skin now appeared hardened in some areas and tender in others, creating a terrifying mosaic of swelling, discoloration, and painful tension. His once distinct facial features had blurred into an expression distorted by swelling and fever. His eyelids drooped heavily, his lips swollen into a shape that made speaking impossible. At times, he drifted into hallucinations. He spoke to people who were not present. He begged for water from attendants who were standing right beside him. He reached out for hands no one was offering. His mind, once sharp and politically shrewd, now flickered like a candle on the verge of extinction. The lesions continued to evolve. They hardened, they thickened. They took on a sickly pallor, then darkened again. Nearly every inch of Louis's body was affected. His hands, once symbols of royal authority, had become swollen and painful, unable to hold even a cup. His legs felt heavy beneath the blankets, and when attendants attempted to shift him, he groaned, a deep, involuntary sound that made even the bravest recoil. The king, who had once walked the hall of mirrors with regal grace, could not move without assistance, and often not even with it. One morning, as the attendants attempted to lift him slightly to change the linens beneath him, something happened that none of them expected, something that altered the room forever. As they shifted his weight, Louis cried out, a muffled, strangled sound, and his body sagged in a way that startled everyone. It was not simply weakness. It was the collapse of muscles and tissues overwhelmed by the disease's assault. The attendants froze, horrified by what they felt beneath their hands. It was as if the king's body could no longer support itself. One of the ladies gasped, stepping back. Another nervously crossed herself. A physician whispered an order to proceed carefully, very carefully, as if the king were no longer a human being, but a fragile object that might come apart under the slightest pressure. This was the moment everyone realized. Louis XV was no longer fighting the disease. The disease was dictating every moment of his existence. The palace responded in panic. Servants barricaded themselves in other wings of Versailles, refusing assignments that brought them within even 100 paces of the king's chamber. Reports circulated privately that the queen and the royal children avoided walking near the hallway altogether, terrified of the infection. The king's favorite courtiers sent messengers instead of visiting personally. No one wanted to be near him, not out of cruelty, but out of terror. Smallpox was death in its most contagious form, and the king had become its epicenter. Meanwhile, inside the suffocating chamber, the king's deterioration accelerated. The air grew thicker each day. Attendants struggled to maintain composure as they cared for him. They changed his linens repeatedly, his body now producing constant fever sweats. They wiped his face with cloths even as new lesions reddened and swelled beneath the skin. They whispered reassurances the king could barely hear. No perfume held in the room. No herb could overpower the scent. No ritual of the court could mask the truth. Louis XV was dying in a way unfit for a king. Painfully, slowly, visibly. At one point, he attempted to rise, mumbling something unintelligible. His arms trembled. He managed to lift his head only inches before collapsing back. His breath came out in a harsh exhale, and his eyelids fluttered weakly. A physician stepped forward, checking his pulse with a trembling hand. The king's heartbeat was rapid but faint, a terrible combination that signaled the body's desperate struggle. The swelling, now severe, had begun affecting his ability to swallow. His attendants spooned broth toward his lips, but most attempts failed. The liquid spilled onto his chin and down his neck. The king did not have the strength to wipe it away. One attendant gently dabbed it with a cloth, tears forming in her eyes as she witnessed the collapse of a monarch she had served for decades. His breathing worsened further. His chest rose and fell with visible effort. His entire body tensed with each inhale. And by the end of the third week, smallpox revealed its final cruelty. The lesions began to darken, first at the edges, and at the center, then in broad patches. Louis's skin developed a mottled appearance, with hues ranging from deep red to brown to a purplish black. The discoloration spread across his arms and torso, giving him the appearance of being bruised from within. His chamber, once filled with polished wood, gold leaf, and silk drapery, now felt like the waiting room of death itself. The attendants could barely look at him without wincing. But the king still clung to life, barely. On the night before smallpox entered its deadliest stage, the palace fell eerily silent. Ministers awaited updates. Servants whispered prayers. The royal household braced for the dawn. Inside the king's chamber, Louis XV lay motionless, his breath thin and feeble, his eyes glazed over, his skin darkening further with every passing hour. What came next would plunge Versailles into sheer horror, because smallpox was about to devour the king completely. By the time dawn rose over Versailles, Louis XV was barely recognizable to those who had known him in life, not because his features were disfigured, although they were, but because the man who had once embodied absolute monarchy had been reduced to a faint, struggling shadow of himself. The smallpox had entered its most destructive phase, and now, instead of merely attacking the surface, it seemed to be consuming him from the inside out, pulling him deeper into a darkness no earthly medicine could illuminate. The first sign of this new stage was the king's breath. It had slowed dramatically, not gradually, suddenly, as if the night had stolen something essential from his lungs. Each inhale now came with effort, scraped through swollen passages that no longer responded to his will. Each exhale trembled, faint but ragged, as though the air itself resisted leaving his body. His attendants noticed immediately. They kept closer watch, hovering with damp cloths, fresh linens, and broths the king could no longer swallow. Each gesture was an attempt to maintain the last illusion of royal dignity. But even illusions collapse under the weight of reality. The king's odor intensified. Not sharp or gruesome, but heavy, warm, unmistakably sick. It clung to the curtains. It settled into the upholstery. It lingered on the clothes of anyone who entered the chamber. No herb or perfume burned in that room lasted more than a few minutes. The air swallowed every fragrance. Versailles, a palace once associated with sweet scents and polished elegance, now held an atmosphere thick with dread. The lesions across his body shifted again. They darkened in tone, thickened in texture, and tightened the skin around them. His face, once swelled nearly beyond recognition, now appeared almost mask-like. His features had stiffened. The muscles beneath were no longer responding. His eyes, hazy, swollen, half-closed, fluttered occasionally, revealing flickers of consciousness that frightened those present more than his delirium had. Because every time he surfaced from the fever's depths, he seemed aware, painfully aware, of his own decay. At one point, he attempted to lift his hand. It rose only halfway before dropping back onto the sheets with a dull thud. The effort left him shaking. His attendants rushed forward, but the king pulled back slightly, shrinking from their touch. Not from fear, but from shame. His dignity was dissolving, and he knew it. Physicians entered in brief shifts, never staying longer than necessary. Their once assured voices now carried an edge of panic, though they tried to mask it with clinical language. They examined the king from a distance whenever possible, relying more on observation than contact. They exchanged glances heavy with meaning, but spoke in whisper-thin fragments. Unwilling to state the truth aloud, Louis XV was dying in a way that terrified even men who had devoted their lives to understanding death. As they took his pulse, one physician murmured, that the king's heart was racing in short, frantic bursts, the desperate beat of a failing system. Another placed a hand near his lips to feel the faint warmth of his breath. They nodded grimly to each other. They wrote notes they hoped history would never see. Then they retreated, leaving the attendants to shoulder the burden. The attendants, the last loyal witnesses to the king's suffering, struggled more than anyone. They had known him as a man. They had served him through celebrations, triumphs, and scandals. And now they watched him unravel. One young attendant, no more than 20, could barely hold himself together. His eyes watered constantly. His hands trembled as he turned the linens. At one moment, he stepped back, gripped the edge of a table, and closed his eyes tightly, as if fighting back panic. A senior attendant quietly ushered him out of the room before the king noticed. But despite the terror gripping everyone around him, the king lingered. Smallpox was unrelenting. It did not allow quick escape. It demanded time, excruciating, drawn-out time. Hours passed. The lesions tightened. The fever returned in waves so intense they seemed to vibrate through the king's body. Louis began slipping into long stretches of unresponsiveness. He no longer attempted to speak. His lips parted only occasionally, releasing faint, uneven breaths. His eyes rolled upward beneath heavy lids. His hands, swollen and stiff, lay unmoving on the blankets. And then something subtle, but chilling, occurred. The king's skin tone shifted again. Not dramatically, but enough to send a ripple of alarm through the attendants. The discoloration deepened, spreading across his limbs, traveling down his neck, settling into the shadowed contours of his body. His face appeared mottled in the candlelight. This was the stage of smallpox physicians feared most. It signaled that the virus had overwhelmed the circulatory and immune systems completely. The king was in the collapse phase. His breathing changed, a faint, wet rattling subtly present with each exhale. It was not loud, not dramatic, but it was unmistakable. The attendants stiffened. They exchanged glances. They had heard that sound before. It appeared in the final hours of plague victims, cholera victims, fever victims. It was the body's last attempt to stay alive. Louis's consciousness dwindled further. His mouth opened in small, involuntary movements. His eyelids flickered faintly. A slow tear rolled from the corner of his left eye, tracing down the uneven surface of his cheek. Whether it was a reflex or a final expression of fear, no one could say. By mid-afternoon, the chamber had grown unbearably hot despite the windows being open. The king's body radiated fever. His blankets felt warm to the touch. His pillow had to be replaced repeatedly as it became damp with sweat. His once lustrous hair lay plastered to his scalp. And then came the moment that shook the entire palace. Louis suddenly gasped, a sharp, unexpected inhale that startled everyone in the room. His eyes widened, revealing a clarity no one anticipated. He looked directly at one of his attendants, truly looked, with an expression of sudden, raw terror. He knew. In that instant, he knew he was dying. The attendants rushed forward, calling for the physicians. But the physicians, now intimately familiar with this pattern, did not hurry. They knew the truth. The king had entered the terminal stage. There was no treatment to administer, no ritual to comfort him, no prayer to slow what was coming. Everyone in the chamber fell silent as Louis XV lay trembling, his chest rising and falling in uneven intervals, his eyes unfocused but still open. The king was close, very close. But the most horrifying hours, the moments that Versailles tried to erase from its legacy, were still ahead, because smallpox still had one final cruelty left to inflict. By the time night fell over Versailles, the palace had retreated into a fearful stillness. Hallways once filled with silk skirts and murmured gossip now echoed only with the faint crackle of torches. Ministers stayed in their apartments. Servants refused to pass near the king's wing. Even the queen remained secluded, her ladies whispering anxious prayers behind closed doors. No one dared approach the chamber where the monarch lay, not because he had become unrecognizable, but because his presence represented a danger greater than any enemy the kingdom had ever faced. Inside the room, the air felt unbearably heavy. Not warm, not thick, oppressive, as if the very space mourned. Louis XV lay almost motionless, his breath a series of shallow, uneven threads that barely stirred the sheets. His eyelids, half swollen shut, trembled faintly as fever surged through him in waves that felt like distant heat lightning. The lesions covering his body, darkening, tightening, no longer looked inflamed. They looked exhausted, as though the disease itself had drained its host of every last reserve it once clung to. The attendants kept watch with a mixture of devotion and dread. Only a handful remained now, the king's chief valet, 2 experienced chambermaids, and 1 trembling young footman who refused to abandon his post even though fear washed over him with every breath he took. Their expressions were strained, their movements slow and deliberate. None of them wanted to disturb the king. None dared push the moment closer. Yet Smallpox did not wait for human timing. A few hours after sunset, the king began to stir, not fully, but in a way that made the attendants straighten instantly. His jaw moved slightly, as if trying to form words. His breathing quickened for a moment, then slowed again. His fingers twitched against the sheets, stiff but purposeful, as though reaching for something unseen. The valet leaned in, whispering the king's name softly, uncertain whether he would be heard. For a moment, Louis's eyelids lifted, revealing glassy eyes clouded by fever and swelling. They flicked toward the valet with a weak glimmer of recognition, then slipped shut again. It was not consciousness. It was instinct, the last fragment of a mind fighting not to disappear. The hours that followed blurred into a painful rhythm of stillness, broken by short, shallow breaths. Each inhale was a struggle. Each exhale sounded thin and fragile. The attendants exchanged worried glances, but none dared leave to summon the physicians. They all knew the truth. Nothing more could be done. Around midnight, the king's breathing suddenly shifted. At first, it was subtle, a faint rattle deep in the chest, barely audible. Then it grew slightly louder, a wet, trembling edge to each exhale. The attendants froze. They knew that sound. Anyone who had witnessed terminal illness knew it. It was not dramatic. It was not violent. It was simply the body's last attempt to function as systems silently failed. The king's chest rose, fell, hesitated, rose again. Each cycle slower than the last. His skin tone shifted once more, adopting a cooler shade beneath the discoloration. His hands, stiff and swollen, lay unmoving atop the blankets. His lips parted, but did not form words. His eyelids flickered occasionally, each flutter weaker than the one before. The valet attempted to give him water, but the king could no longer swallow. The liquid dripped down his chin, soaking into the linens. The chambermaid gently wiped it away, her hands steady, but her eyes brimming with tears. Smallpox had taken his strength, his voice, his mobility. Now it began taking his presence. Then, shortly after the candles were replaced, something unexpected happened. Louis inhaled sharply, not a breath of strength, but a sudden reflexive gasp, as though his body was fighting against an invisible undertow. The attendants jumped to their feet. The valet leaned in, calling the king's name again, louder this time. Louis's eyes opened, fully, for the first time in nearly a day. For several seconds, he stared at the ceiling, wide-eyed, as though seeing something no one else in the room could perceive. His mouth moved. No sound emerged. His fingers tightened slightly, curling inward. A tremor passed through him, faint but unmistakable. He was conscious, trapped inside a body no longer capable of expressing anything. He tried to draw another breath. It came out strained and shallow. He tried again. This one rattled softly. And then something even worse, something the attendants had feared but prayed would never happen, unfolded slowly, inch by inch. The king became agitated, not violently, not dramatically, but restlessly, with small, subtle movements that filled the room with dread. His head turned slightly to one side. His lips parted repeatedly in soundless attempts at speech. His chest rose and fell in uneven bursts. His hands twitched. His features tightened with what looked horribly like fear. The valet whispered soothing words. He placed a hand lightly on the king's shoulder. The chambermaid approached with a damp cloth. They hoped their calm presence would anchor him. But the king's eyes darted, unfocused, frantic, reflecting confusion and panic. Louis XV understood, in some final, horrible flicker of clarity, that his body was failing completely. And with that realization, the agitation increased. He shifted beneath the blankets in small, uncoordinated motions. His breath quickened in short bursts of anxiety before collapsing again into slow, rattling exhales. His eyelids blinked rapidly, then struggled to stay open. His hands opened and closed faintly, as though trying to grasp something in the air. The attendants exchanged terrified glances. Was he in pain? Was he suffocating? Was he aware of what was happening? No one knew. But everyone understood what this stage meant. They had seen it before in other victims. The body was preparing for its final collapse. Minutes stretched into an hour. The king's movements slowed. His breath grew softer, then quieter still. The rattling softened, then nearly faded. Only the faintest sound remained. The attendants leaned closer, barely breathing. Louis's eyelids fluttered a final time. His chest rose, barely, and then sank. No sound followed. No inhale came after it. Stillness filled the chamber. Not peaceful, but absolute. The valet placed a trembling hand near the king's mouth to feel for warmth. Nothing. He pressed 2 fingers against the neck. Still nothing. Louis XV had died. But the horror Versailles feared most, the aftermath of death by smallpox, had not yet begun. What happened to his body in the hours that followed would horrify the palace so deeply that witnesses begged to forget it. Before we enter the most disturbing and suppressed chapter of Louis XV's death, make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss the conclusion of this historical nightmare. And tell me, do you think the court had a moral duty to reveal the truth about his death, or hide it to protect the monarchy? The moment Louis XV died, a terrible silence settled over Versailles. Not the reverent stillness that follows the passing of a beloved monarch, but the tense, suffocating quiet of people realizing they were trapped with something they did not understand and could not control. The king's attendants stood frozen, unsure whether they should move, speak, flee, or pray. For several long seconds, they remained in place as though the slightest sound might shatter the fragile boundary between life and death. But death had already claimed the room. The first change was subtle, almost imperceptible. A shift in the air, a heaviness that deepened the longer the attendants stood by the body. The fever heat that had radiated from Louis's skin only minutes earlier was gone. In its place lay a cold stillness that seeped into the chamber, crawling across the marble floor and up the carved wooden bed. The valet, still trembling, reached out with a cloth to close the king's eyes, only to pause mid-gesture. Something about the skin made him hesitate, not its appearance, but its temperature. It was already cooling at an unsettling pace, far faster than he had expected. He pressed the cloth gently over the eyelids, smoothing them shut. The king's swollen features settled into a strange, rigid calm. Not peaceful, not rested, simply stopped. There was no time for mourning. Protocol demanded immediate action. The attendants stepped back as the physicians re-entered the room. Their faces, already strained, darkened further when they saw the king. They exchanged glances that spoke volumes, Fear, urgency, resignation. They knew what came next. They had seen what smallpox did after the final breath. Death did not halt the disease. It accelerated the transformation. The physicians ordered the windows flung open. Cold night air swept into the chamber, rustling the curtains and extinguishing 2 candles. The sudden draft startled the attendants, but the physicians insisted. Fresh air was the only hope of delaying what they all feared. Within an hour, the king's skin tone began to shift, not dramatically, not grotesquely, but unmistakably. The discoloration that had mottled his body and life deepened after death, taking on darker hues that spread across his limbs. The lesions, tight and swollen only hours before, now appeared sunken in some areas and oddly raised in others. The contrast created an unsettling effect under the candlelight, the kind of sight that made even the physicians avert their eyes. The chambermaids crossed themselves quietly. The young footman stepped back until he reached the wall. No one spoke. Louis XV, once the most powerful man in Europe, now lay at the mercy of nature's most merciless disease. And the disease had not finished its work. As the night passed, the king's body continued to change. The fever sweat that had drenched his sheets dried quickly, leaving the linen stiff and discolored. The odor in the room, already oppressive before his death, grew sharper, heavier. No amount of incense or perfume could mask it. The attendants lit more candles, more herbs, more braziers, but nothing improved the air. It seemed to cling to their hair, their clothes, their skin. By dawn, the odor had become so overwhelming that the chambermaids could barely breathe without covering their faces. One excused herself entirely, stumbling into the hallway and collapsing against a column as she tried to steady her stomach. The other continued her work, though her hands shook violently with every motion. The valet de chambre, loyal to the end, refused to leave. By the 2nd day after the king's death, the transformation deepened. The discoloration across his face and torso spread further, darkening in the creases of his skin. The lesions sat differently now, some appearing flatter, others more pronounced. The king's once familiar features had altered yet again, settling into a stiff, unnatural stillness that made him look less like a sleeping man and more like an abandoned effigy. The physicians spoke in hushed voices, debating how quickly the body needed to be removed, how best to contain the environment, how to protect attendants who risked infection simply by breathing the same air. But smallpox did not wait for debate. It never had. It never would. By the 3rd day, nearly the entire palace knew the truth. No one wanted to approach the king's remains. Some feared contagion. Some feared fainting. Some feared the memory itself, the imprint of seeing a monarch in a state no history book would dare describe honestly. Only a select few were ordered to enter the chamber. They obeyed because duty demanded it, not because courage compelled them. Their steps were slow, their breaths shallow, their hands trembling. They washed the king's face and hands as gently as possible. They changed his linens with practiced efficiency, averting their eyes when necessary. The darkening continued. The odor worsened. The attendants' movements grew faster and more desperate. Finally, the decision was made. The king must be placed in a coffin immediately. Not tomorrow. Not after ceremony. Now, the carpenters arrived with a simple wooden coffin, far plainer than the king's status deserved. But no one dared question it. They worked quickly, wiping sweat from their brows, glancing repeatedly toward the bed as though expecting the room itself to protest. When the attendants lifted the king's body, they recoiled, not from anything graphic, but from the unnatural heaviness they felt. The swelling, the fever, the fluids trapped within him had not dissipated in death. They had intensified. It took every ounce of strength to lift him from the bed and lower him into the coffin. His limbs seemed stiff and unwieldy. His torso felt heavier than expected. The carpenters stood frozen, their expressions pale as the attendants adjusted the body into place. Once inside the coffin, the king's features seemed even more foreign under the low light. His once distinguished profile had transformed too drastically for recognition. The attendants arranged the linens around him, smoothing his clothing, adjusting his hair, doing everything possible to restore dignity. But dignity was no longer theirs to give. When they finally closed the lid, a collective exhale filled the room, a breath of sorrow, of relief, of fear, of exhaustion. The king who had ruled France for decades, who had lived in opulence and indulgence, who had believed himself destined for glory, was gone, and the palace that once celebrated him now scrambled to forget the final days they had witnessed. Smallpox had devoured Louis XV alive. His chamber had become a tomb long before the coffin was sealed, and Versailles, glittering, gilded, perfumed Versailles, was left with a memory it would spend generations trying to bury.